The cruelest mistake a person can make is believing someone else's future ends where their patience does. On a rainy Thursday evening in downtown Chicago, Brandon Reed stood in the foyer of the house he once proudly called his greatest achievement. The property stretched across nearly 6,000 square feet in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. Marble floors reflected the glow of imported chandeliers. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked tree-lined streets glistening beneath the rain. Everything inside the home suggested success. Everything except the atmosphere. Tension filled the air like a storm waiting to break. Vanessa Carter stood near the staircase holding a small overnight bag. She had not packed much because until an hour ago she never imagined she would need to. The house that once echoed with plans for the future suddenly felt unfamiliar. Cold. Temporary. Brandon stood several feet away with his arms crossed, avoiding her eyes. For months their marriage had been drifting toward this moment. Conversations became arguments. Arguments became silence. Silence became distance. Yet even now, Vanessa believed there might still be room for understanding. Brandon did not share that belief. Near the dining room entrance, two of Brandon's closest friends sat quietly pretending not to witness what was happening. The uncomfortable reality was impossible to ignore. Everyone in the house understood this conversation would change everything. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere in the kitchen, a forgotten coffee machine hummed in the background. The ordinary sounds only made the moment feel more surreal. Brandon finally spoke. "I think it is time we stop pretending this works." Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly. Not because she was defeated. Because she was trying to understand how someone she once loved could sound so detached. "After everything we built?" she asked quietly. Brandon exhaled. "People change." The answer felt rehearsed, like something he had repeated privately until it no longer carried emotion. Vanessa looked around the foyer. Family photographs still lined the walls. Vacation memories. Holiday celebrations. Smiling faces frozen in happier years. Evidence of a life that had once seemed unbreakable. Yet Brandon no longer looked at those pictures. He looked only toward the future he imagined for himself. "I cannot keep doing this," he continued. "Neither of us are happy." Vanessa wanted to argue, wanted to remind him of promises made and sacrifices shared. Instead, she remained silent. Somewhere deep inside, she sensed the decision had already been made long before tonight. Brandon simply waited until he was ready to announce it. One of his friends shifted uncomfortably in a nearby chair. Another stared down at the floor. Nobody intervened. Nobody challenged him. That hurt almost as much as Brandon's words. The people who once filled their home with laughter now sat quietly while her marriage collapsed in front of them. Brandon glanced toward the overnight bag beside her. "It would be easier if you left tonight." The sentence landed heavily. Not because it was shouted, because it was spoken so casually, as though removing her from the life they built together was merely another item on a checklist. Vanessa looked at him carefully. For the first time all evening, she truly saw him. Not the man she married. Not the man she defended. Not the man she believed would always stand beside her. She saw someone eager to erase a chapter before the ink had fully dried. Rain continued falling outside. The foyer remained silent. After several seconds, Vanessa reached for the handle of her bag. Her movements were calm, deliberate. There were no dramatic speeches, no angry accusations. Just a woman gathering the final pieces of her dignity before walking away. Brandon interpreted her silence as surrender. What he failed to understand was that silence can mean many things. Sometimes it means defeat. Sometimes it means wisdom. And sometimes it means a person has stopped arguing because their future no longer depends on being understood. As Vanessa stepped toward the front door, neither Brandon nor anyone else in that house realized they were witnessing the end of one story and the beginning of another. A story that would eventually return to this moment and change the meaning of it forever. The rain continued long after Vanessa Carter disappeared into the Chicago night. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement as passing cars sprayed thin sheets of water along the empty sidewalks. Behind her, the house she once called home faded into the darkness. Ahead of her stretched a future she could not yet see. The overnight bag felt heavier than it should have, not because of what was inside, because it contained the final remains of a life she never expected to leave behind. Across town, however, the mood inside Brandon Reed's world changed almost immediately. By the following weekend, the tension that had filled his house was gone, replaced by celebration. Music drifted through the same rooms where difficult conversations had recently taken place. Expensive bottles lined the kitchen island. Friends gathered beneath the chandeliers. Laughter echoed through the open living spaces. To anyone arriving that evening, it looked less like the end of a marriage and more like the beginning of a new chapter. Brandon stood near the bar surrounded by several friends who had witnessed Vanessa's departure days earlier. The atmosphere felt lighter, more carefree, at least on the surface. One guest raised a glass and grinned. "You finally look relaxed." Brandon laughed. "Maybe because I finally am." Several people nodded. Another friend leaned against the marble countertop. "You did what you had to do." The statement received immediate agreement. Conversations moved quickly from divorce to business opportunities, vacation plans, and social events. Nobody seemed interested in discussing Vanessa. In many ways, that hurt more than open criticism would have. It was as if she had already been erased from the room. Brandon appeared comfortable with that. Throughout the evening, he moved confidently through the crowd, accepting encouragement and congratulations disguised as sympathy. Several people spoke as though ending the marriage had been an act of courage rather than loss. Brandon never corrected them. In fact, he seemed to enjoy the narrative. The story being told around him was simple. He had freed himself from something that no longer served him. He had chosen a better future. He had moved on. Near midnight, a guest casually asked whether he had heard from Vanessa since she left. Brandon barely looked up from his drink. Not once. The answer came with surprising ease. Another guest shrugged. "Probably for the best." Brandon nodded. Some people are meant to stay in the past. The group laughed softly before returning to other topics. Nobody noticed how quickly those words left his mouth, as though he had been rehearsing them. Across the city, Vanessa sat alone inside a modest extended-stay apartment rented by the week. The space was clean but simple. A small kitchen, a narrow living area, one bedroom. Rain tapped against the window while a coffee maker hummed quietly on the counter. Cardboard boxes sat unopened near the wall. The silence felt unfamiliar after years inside a large home. Yet strangely, it also felt honest. For the first time in months, there was no tension. No walking carefully through conversations. No pretending everything was fine. Vanessa sat beside the window and watched headlights move through the rain below. Her phone remained silent. No messages. No apologies. No explanations. She lowered her eyes toward the warm cup resting between her hands. The loneliness was real. The uncertainty was real. But beneath both emotions lived something unexpected. Relief. The realization surprised her. She had lost a marriage. She had lost a home. She had lost the future she imagined. Yet she had also escaped a life where she was no longer valued. Back at the house, Brandon's celebration continued well into the night. Music played louder. More guests arrived. More drinks were poured. Looking around the room, Brandon believed he was standing at the beginning of his greatest chapter. Everyone around him seemed to agree. What none of them understood was that true turning points rarely announce themselves when they happen. Sometimes the person leaving is the one moving towards something greater. Sometimes the person celebrating is the one standing still. And while Brandon raised another glass to the future he thought he wanted, Vanessa quietly took the first step toward the future that was already waiting for her. Months passed, then a year, then another. Time moved forward with the quiet persistence of a river carving through stone. In Brandon Reed's world, life continued exactly as he expected. New business ventures occupied his attention. Weekend gatherings filled his calendar. New faces appeared in his social circles. The large house remained full of activity, laughter, and carefully curated appearances. If Vanessa Carter's name surfaced at all, it was usually brief enough to disappear before the conversation settled. Eventually, people stopped mentioning her altogether. In many ways, that was what Brandon wanted. Erasing someone is easier when nobody else remembers them. One autumn evening, nearly 3 years after Vanessa left, Brandon attended a charity fundraiser at an upscale hotel in downtown Chicago. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom, while local business leaders and social influencers mingled beneath soft golden lighting. Waiters moved gracefully between conversations carrying trays of sparkling drinks. The event was exactly the type of gathering Brandon enjoyed. Familiar faces, professional opportunities, public recognition. Near one of the cocktail tables, several guests discussed old acquaintances and mutual friends. The conversation drifted from real estate to travel before someone unexpectedly asked, "Whatever happened to Vanessa Carter?" The question lingered in the air for a moment. Several people glanced toward Brandon, not because they expected drama, because he was the only person who might know the answer. Brandon took a sip from his glass and shrugged. "Honestly, I have no idea." The response sounded casual, detached, practiced. A woman standing nearby frowned thoughtfully. "I have not seen her in years." Another guest nodded. "Neither have I." Someone else laughed softly. "Maybe she moved away." The group accepted the possibility and quickly returned to other subjects. Within seconds, Vanessa disappeared from the conversation as easily as she had disappeared from their lives. Brandon seemed perfectly comfortable with that. Yet what nobody in the room realized was how little anyone actually knew. Vanessa had not vanished. She had simply stopped announcing her existence to people who were never interested in hearing her story. Across the city, her life looked dramatically different from the assumptions people made about her. The modest apartment she once rented by the week had become a distant memory. The uncertainty that followed her divorce had gradually transformed into confidence earned through perseverance. Early mornings became opportunities instead of burdens. Professional setbacks became lessons instead of failures. One project led to another. One connection opened the door to the next. Slowly, almost invisibly, Vanessa rebuilt her life from the ground up. Yet none of the people discussing her at the fundraiser knew any of that. They imagined a blank space where her future should have been. Back inside the ballroom, Brandon moved comfortably through the crowd. He laughed at jokes, exchanged business cards, accepted compliments about recent accomplishments. Everything appeared successful. Everything appeared polished. Yet there was something strangely repetitive about his life now. Every event looked similar to the one before it. Every conversation followed familiar patterns. Every achievement seemed to require immediate replacement by another. The excitement never lasted as long as it once did. Near the end of the evening, Brandon stepped outside onto a rooftop terrace overlooking the Chicago skyline. Cool autumn air swept between the buildings while thousands of city lights stretched toward the horizon. He stood alone for several moments, staring across the skyline. The city looked endless, full of possibilities. Yet an unexpected thought crossed his mind. Not regret. Not exactly. More like curiosity. A brief question he had not allowed himself to ask in years. Where did Vanessa end up? The thought disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Brandon shook his head and returned inside. The fundraiser continued. The music played. The conversations flowed. Life moved forward. What he did not know was that somewhere beyond the world he understood, Vanessa was already becoming the woman who would one day walk back into his life and make every assumption he ever made about her collapse in a single evening. For now, however, she remained exactly what everyone believed she was. Forgotten, invisible, gone. And that misunderstanding was about to become the greatest surprise of Brandon's life. The years that followed taught Vanessa Carter something nobody had explained when she first walked away from Brandon Reed's house, carrying a single overnight bag. Healing rarely arrives all at once. It arrives in small victories that seem insignificant when they happen. A morning when getting out of bed feels easier. A day when a painful memory no longer controls your thoughts. A moment when you stop asking why something ended and start focusing on what comes next. That was how Vanessa rebuilt her life. Quietly, gradually, without an audience. Chicago greeted her with harsh winters and long workdays. During the first year after the divorce, she accepted nearly every consulting project she could find. Some assignments paid well, others barely covered expenses. Yet she approached each opportunity with determination. She woke before sunrise most mornings. The city outside her apartment window often remained dark as she reviewed proposals, prepared presentations, and studied new industry certifications. Coffee became a constant companion. So did discipline. There were evenings when exhaustion followed her home like a shadow. Yet every completed project created another opportunity. Every challenge expanded her confidence. Slowly, the uncertainty that once defined her life began to disappear. The modest apartment eventually gave way to a larger one overlooking the Chicago River. Then came professional recognition, new clients, better contracts, invitations to conferences and networking events. The transformation did not happen because someone rescued her. It happened because she refused to stay where life left her. One spring morning, Nearly 4 years after the divorce, Vanessa stood beside a large window inside her office watching sunlight reflect across the river below. Construction cranes moved across the skyline. Water taxis drifted between bridges. The city felt alive. Her assistant entered carrying a schedule for the upcoming week. Meetings, presentations, charity events, business dinners. Vanessa reviewed the list and smiled. Not because of the accomplishments, because she finally recognized the woman she had become. The woman staring back from the glass was stronger than the one who once left Brandon's house in the rain. More importantly, she no longer measured her worth through someone else's approval. Later that evening, she attended a charity fundraiser hosted inside one of Chicago's historic hotels. The ballroom buzzed with conversation beneath elegant chandeliers. Business leaders, philanthropists, and community figures filled the room. Vanessa preferred staying near the edges of events like this. She enjoyed meaningful conversations, but disliked being the center of attention. Holding a glass of sparkling water, she stood near an art display while guests moved through the ballroom. That was when she noticed something unusual. As a tall man entered through the main doors, conversations subtly changed. Nobody rushed toward him. Nobody behaved dramatically. Yet people noticed. Several guests greeted him with genuine respect. Others stepped aside naturally. The reaction was impossible to miss. Vanessa watched with curiosity. The man appeared calm, composed, and completely uninterested in attracting attention. His dark suit was impeccably tailored. His confidence seemed effortless. More importantly, he carried himself like someone who never needed to prove anything. Across the room, an event organizer approached him immediately, then a business owner, then a city official. Each interaction reflected the same thing. Respect. Not admiration built on publicity. Respect earned over time. Vanessa eventually returned her attention to the artwork. A few minutes later, however, she heard a familiar voice beside her. That painting seems to have more admirers than the open bar. She turned and found the same man standing nearby with a relaxed smile. Vanessa laughed softly. That may be the most impressive achievement of the evening. The conversation that followed felt surprisingly easy. They spoke about art, travel, Chicago architecture. Neither discussed personal history. Neither attempted to impress the other. For nearly 20 minutes, the noise of the ballroom faded into the background. Before leaving, the man extended his hand. Victor Moretti. Vanessa shook it. Vanessa Carter. As he walked away, several guests greeted him again with visible respect. Vanessa watched the interactions briefly before returning to her conversation. At that moment, she had no idea that the man who just entered her life would eventually change the direction of her future forever. Nor did she realize that one day, the entire world Brandon Reed believed he controlled would react the exact same way whenever Victor Moretti entered a room. The conversation at the charity fundraiser should have ended the moment Vanessa Carter and Victor Moretti exchanged names. In most circumstances, it would have. Two strangers meet, share a pleasant discussion, and continue in separate directions. Yet something about that evening lingered long after the ballroom lights dimmed. Over the following weeks, their paths crossed again, sometimes at business functions, sometimes at community events, once at a downtown cafe overlooking the Chicago River where both happened to arrive before separate meetings. Each encounter felt natural rather than orchestrated. Neither seemed interested in rushing anything. That alone made their connection unusual. Vanessa had spent years rebuilding her life and had little interest in becoming dependent on anyone again. Victor, meanwhile, carried himself like a man comfortable with patience. He never pushed, never performed, never tried to impress her with stories about influence or success. In fact, the more time they spent together, the more Vanessa realized how little he talked about himself. One snowy December evening, they met for dinner at a quiet restaurant tucked between historic buildings near the river. Outside, fresh snow covered the sidewalks and softened the sounds of the city. Inside, warm lighting reflected off polished wood and large windows. Their conversation lasted nearly 3 hours, yet neither noticed the time passing. They discussed books, architecture, travel, and family traditions. They shared stories about mistakes they had survived and lessons they wished they had learned sooner. For the first time in years, Vanessa found herself laughing freely. Not the polite laughter often required at networking events. Genuine laughter. The kind that arrives when a person feels completely at ease. As the months passed, One detail became impossible to ignore. Everywhere Victor went, people treated him with extraordinary respect. Hotel managers greeted him by name. Business owners adjusted schedules to meet with him. Community leaders sought his advice. At first, Vanessa assumed he was simply well-connected. Then she began noticing the consistency. The reactions were remarkably similar no matter where they were. Respect, admiration, trust. One evening, while attending a fundraising gala, she finally asked him about it. Victor smiled softly. People create stories when they do not have information. Vanessa laughed. That is not an answer. It is the most honest answer I can give. Eventually, she learned more. Victor managed an extensive network of international businesses, private investments, hospitality properties, and logistics companies. His influence stretched across multiple industries. More importantly, he had spent decades building relationships based on loyalty and trust. The nickname many people used when discussing him carried an almost legendary quality. Yet Victor himself never seemed interested in titles. He cared more about people than reputation. That realization mattered to Vanessa far more than any business success. Time continued moving forward. Seasons changed. Their connection deepened. One afternoon, while walking beside the river during the first warm days of spring, Victor stopped and looked out across the water. Boats drifted beneath the bridges while sunlight reflected off the skyline. The city seemed suspended between past and future. Vanessa noticed he had grown unusually quiet. Then he turned toward her. "You know what I admire most about you?" She smiled. "I'm almost afraid to ask." Victor shook his head gently. "You built your life back without bitterness." Vanessa lowered her eyes briefly. Few people understood how much work that required. Some days were harder than others. "I know." His voice remained calm. "That is why it matters." Months later, their relationship was no longer a quiet possibility. It had become something undeniable. Friends noticed. Colleagues noticed. Entire social circles noticed. Yet neither of them felt any need to announce it publicly. They simply continued building a life together. Steadily. Intentionally. The same way trust had been built from the beginning. Meanwhile, far across the city, Brandon Reed remained completely unaware of what was unfolding. He still believed Vanessa existed somewhere in his past. Forgotten. Irrelevant. A chapter already closed. What he did not understand was that the woman he dismissed years ago was now standing beside one of the most respected men he would ever encounter. And very soon, those two worlds were about to collide. 5 years after Vanessa Carter walked away from Brandon Reed's house in the rain, an invitation arrived that neither she nor Victor Moretti expected to matter. It was a formal invitation to the annual Legacy Foundation Gala, one of the most prestigious charity events in Chicago. Business leaders, investors, philanthropists, public figures, and influential families attended every year. The guest list was carefully curated. The ballroom reservations were secured nearly 12 months in advance. Invitations carried a level of prestige many people openly competed to receive. Vanessa glanced at the envelope while sitting in her office overlooking the Chicago River. Sunlight reflected across the water below as boats moved between the bridges. Her schedule already looked crowded. Charity board meetings, consulting engagements, community projects. She almost set the invitation aside without opening it. Then she noticed another name printed on the event materials. Brandon Reed. He was listed among several corporate sponsors supporting the gala. Vanessa stared at the page for a few moments before quietly placing it on her desk. The name no longer carried the emotional weight it once did. Yet seeing it unexpectedly felt strange. Like discovering an old photograph hidden inside a drawer you had not opened in years. That evening, she showed the invitation to Victor. They sat on the balcony of their condominium watching city lights emerge across the skyline as sunset faded into twilight. Victor studied the card before looking at her. "Do you want to go?" Vanessa considered the question carefully. There was a time when the answer would have been easy. She would have avoided the event entirely. But that woman no longer existed. "I think so," she said. Victor nodded. "Then we go." There was no further discussion. No dramatic conversation about the past. No concern about who might be there. They simply made a decision and moved forward. 2 weeks later, the Legacy Foundation Gala transformed one of Chicago's most luxurious hotels into a showcase of elegance and influence. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom from 40-foot ceilings. Live music drifted through the air. Large windows overlooked the city skyline, glowing against the night sky. Guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored suits while photographers captured arrivals near the entrance. Inside the ballroom, Brandon Reed moved comfortably through familiar social circles. He had become a recognized figure at events like this. Sponsors greeted him warmly. Business associates exchanged handshakes and compliments. Everything felt predictable, comfortable, successful. Near the center of the ballroom, Brandon spoke with several investors while discussing upcoming projects. Laughter flowed easily through the conversation. The atmosphere remained relaxed. Then something changed. It began near the entrance. Not loudly, not dramatically. A subtle shift in attention moved through the room. One conversation paused, then another. Several guests glanced toward the doors. Others followed their gaze. The change spread slowly but unmistakably. Brandon noticed it immediately. At first, he assumed a celebrity had arrived, perhaps a major donor or public figure. He turned casually toward the entrance. Then he froze. Standing beneath the soft golden lights of the ballroom entrance was Vanessa Carter. For a moment, the noise around him seemed distant. The years disappeared. Memories resurfaced without permission. The rain, the overnight bag, the front door closing behind her. Yet the woman standing across the ballroom looked nothing like the version preserved in his memory. Vanessa carried herself with a calm confidence that could not be purchased or imitated. Her elegant gown reflected understated sophistication. Her posture radiated composure. Most striking of all was her expression. Peace. Genuine peace. She was not angry, not wounded, not searching the room for validation. She simply looked happy. Nearby guests immediately recognized her. Whispers moved through the ballroom. Curiosity spread. Brandon felt his heartbeat quicken as Vanessa stepped fully into the room. Yet what truly changed the atmosphere had not even entered the ballroom yet, because several feet behind her, another figure was walking through the entrance. And within seconds, everyone who recognized him would completely forget whatever conversation they had been having before. The moment Victor Moretti stepped fully into the ballroom, the atmosphere changed in a way that could not be explained by wealth alone. It was not loud. Nobody announced his arrival. No spotlight followed him across the room. Yet conversations paused. Heads turned. A subtle wave of recognition moved through the crowd with remarkable speed. People who had been discussing investments, charities, and business opportunities suddenly found new reasons to pay attention to the entrance. Standing beside Vanessa Carter, Victor appeared completely unaffected by the reaction. His dark, tailored suit reflected understated elegance. His posture remained relaxed. He carried himself with the same calm confidence that had first captured Vanessa's attention years earlier. Across the ballroom, Brandon Reed watched the shift unfold without fully understanding it. He recognized that Victor was important. The reactions made that obvious. What he did not yet understand was just how important. Nearby guests began whispering among themselves. Several names floated through the room. Most were followed by surprise, others by disbelief. One investor standing near Brandon lowered his voice. "That is Victor Moretti." Brandon nodded slowly. The name sounded familiar, though he could not immediately place it. The investor glanced toward the entrance again. "I have been trying to get a meeting with him for almost 2 years." Another executive overheard the comment and joined the conversation. "Everyone has." The statement was delivered with a laugh, but nobody disagreed. Across the ballroom, several influential guests were already making their way toward Victor. A hotel owner greeted him warmly. A transportation executive shook his hand with visible respect. A foundation board member interrupted an ongoing conversation simply to welcome him personally. Each interaction reinforced the same message. Victor was not merely respected. He occupied a level of influence few people ever reach. Brandon felt a growing sense of unease. Earlier in the evening, he had been comfortably positioned among the event's most prominent guests. Now he found himself watching attention drift elsewhere. Toward Vanessa, toward Victor, toward a story he never expected to see unfold. Near the entrance, Vanessa accepted greetings with quiet grace. She smiled warmly, exchanged brief conversations, and thanked several people for their kindness. Nothing about her behavior suggested she was trying to impress anyone. In fact, the opposite seemed true. The less she sought attention, the more attention she received. Guests noticed her composure. They noticed her confidence. Most of all, they noticed how naturally she belonged beside Victor. A woman standing near Brandon whispered to her companion, "They look perfect together." The companion nodded. "They really do." The observation landed harder than either of them realized. Brandon looked toward Vanessa again. For the first time, he saw something he had never expected. She was not merely surviving without him. She was thriving. Near the ballroom's center, another wave of recognition swept through the crowd as more guests arrived and discovered who was present. Conversations repeatedly followed the same pattern. Surprise, recognition, respect. Several people approached Victor with obvious admiration. Yet Victor treated everyone the same way. Polite, attentive, humble. That contrast only increased the respect people felt toward him. One of the gala organizers eventually crossed the room and personally welcomed both Victor and Vanessa. The organizer spoke with genuine warmth before guiding them toward a preferred seating area near the stage. Guests noticed that too. Everything about the evening seemed to confirm the same reality. Vanessa had not returned to prove a point. She had returned as someone whose life had grown far beyond the limits others once imagined for her. Brandon remained standing among familiar faces, yet he felt strangely isolated. Around him, the room continued shifting. The admiration he once enjoyed no longer felt automatic. The center of attention had moved, not because anyone demanded it, because authenticity has a way of drawing people in. As Victor gently placed a hand near Vanessa's back and guided her toward their table, another realization began spreading through the ballroom. People were no longer asking who Vanessa arrived with. They were beginning to wonder how someone as remarkable as Vanessa had ever been underestimated in the first place. And before the night ended, that question would become impossible for Brandon to ignore. As the evening progressed, the shift inside the ballroom became impossible to ignore. Earlier, Brandon Reed had moved comfortably through the event surrounded by familiar admiration. People greeted him warmly. Investors sought his attention. Sponsors welcomed his participation. Yet now the room seemed to revolve around a different center entirely. Everywhere Brandon looked, conversations eventually found their way back to Vanessa Carter and Victor Moretti. The change happened gradually enough that nobody could point to a single moment when it began. Yet by the middle of the evening, everyone could feel it. Near the stage, a group of executives discussed upcoming charitable initiatives. Brandon approached with confidence, prepared to join the conversation. Before he could speak, one of the executives smiled and said, "Have you met Victor yet tonight?" Another immediately nodded. "Remarkable man." The discussion shifted away from Brandon almost instantly. He forced a polite smile before excusing himself. Similar moments repeated throughout the evening. A donor praised Vanessa's community work. A business owner spoke about Victor's reputation for loyalty and generosity. A foundation director mentioned projects both had quietly supported without seeking recognition. None of the comments were intended as comparisons. Yet comparisons happen naturally. Across the ballroom, Vanessa remained completely unaware of the effect she was having. She sat beside Victor during portions of the program, occasionally speaking with guests who approached their table. Her composure never changed. She did not seek attention. She did not remind anyone of the past. She did not mention Brandon once. Ironically, that made her presence even more powerful. The less she tried to prove, the more people admired her. Near one of the ballroom windows, two women who had known Brandon years earlier watched Vanessa speaking with several guests. One shook her head slowly. "I barely recognized her." The other smiled. "She looks happier than I have ever seen her." "She really does." The first woman glanced toward Brandon, standing alone near the bar. Then she looked back toward Vanessa. Funny how life works. Similar observations echoed throughout the room. Not because people enjoyed gossip, because the contrast was impossible to ignore. Years ago, many assumed Vanessa's story ended the night she left Brandon's house. Tonight, everyone could see how wrong they had been. Victor eventually rose from his table to greet several longtime associates. As he moved through the ballroom, people welcomed him with a level of respect Brandon had rarely witnessed. Yet what stood out most was Victor's consistency. Whether speaking with influential donors or hotel staff, his demeanor remained exactly the same. Respectful, warm, attentive. Guests noticed that quality. They admired it. Brandon noticed it too. For the first time all evening, he found himself studying Victor rather than competing with him. What he saw unsettled him even more. Victor never appeared interested in proving he mattered. Everyone else simply knew he did. Meanwhile, Vanessa continued receiving quiet praise from people who had once overlooked her. A board member thanked her for recent charitable work. A nonprofit director complimented her leadership. A local entrepreneur asked for advice regarding a community initiative. Each conversation revealed another layer of the life she had built after leaving. Brandon listened from a distance as fragments of those conversations reached him. The woman he once dismissed had become someone others genuinely respected. Not because of who she married, because of who she became. As dessert was served and the evening entered its final stages, Brandon realized something uncomfortable. Nobody was choosing sides. Nobody was trying to embarrass him. The room had simply responded to authenticity. People naturally gravitated toward character, confidence, and purpose. Vanessa and Victor embodied those qualities without effort. Looking across the ballroom, Brandon saw Vanessa laughing softly at something Victor said. The expression on her face was completely genuine. There was no trace of the sadness he remembered from years ago. No lingering resentment. No need for closure. She had already moved beyond all of it. That realization landed harder than any public humiliation ever could. Because in that moment, Brandon understood the truth. Vanessa had not returned to reclaim anything from her past. She had returned as living proof that her future had always been bigger than the limits he placed on her. And as more guests gathered around her table than his, the room quietly revealed something Brandon never expected to learn. The woman he once thought he left behind had become the person everyone wanted to know. By the time the Legacy Foundation Gala approached its conclusion, the ballroom had settled into a quieter rhythm. The formal presentations were over. The charity pledges had been announced. Guests moved more slowly now, lingering near tables and windows while enjoying the final hour of the evening. Beyond the glass walls, Chicago glittered beneath the night sky. Thousands of lights stretched across the skyline like stars scattered among steel and glass. Inside, however, the most memorable story of the evening had nothing to do with donations or speeches. It was the story standing only a few feet away from Brandon Reed. Near the waterfront-style observation windows overlooking the city, Vanessa Carter and Victor Moretti shared a quiet conversation. They appeared completely at ease. The attention surrounding them had never changed their behavior. They remained the same people who entered the ballroom hours earlier. Calm, genuine, comfortable in their own lives. Brandon watched from a distance. Not with anger. Not even with jealousy anymore. Something deeper had replaced those emotions. Perspective. For the first time in years, he was seeing the full picture. He remembered the rainy night when Vanessa left carrying a single overnight bag. He remembered believing she would struggle without him. He remembered assuming her story would gradually fade into the background while his continued moving forward. Looking across the ballroom now, he realized how completely wrong he had been. Vanessa's story had not ended when she walked out his front door. It had only begun. Throughout the evening, people approached her because they respected her. They admired the life she built. They valued her contributions. Victor's presence amplified that reality, but it did not create it. The admiration directed toward Vanessa belonged to her. She had earned it through years of perseverance, growth, and quiet determination. Near one of the exits, several guests said their goodbyes before departing. Others stopped briefly at Vanessa and Victor's table to offer congratulations on upcoming projects and future plans. Each interaction carried the same warmth and sincerity. Nobody was pretending. Nobody was performing. Brandon noticed that too. Success built on image often disappears when the audience leaves. Success built on character remains. As the ballroom gradually emptied, Victor stood and offered Vanessa his hand. She smiled and accepted it. Together they prepared to leave. The gesture was simple, yet it carried a quiet elegance that seemed to summarize everything about their relationship. Mutual respect, trust, partnership. No need for grand displays. No need for approval. They had already built something real. For a brief moment, Vanessa's eyes drifted across the room. She noticed Brandon standing near the stage. Their gazes met. Years earlier, such a moment might have reopened old wounds. Tonight it felt different. There was no resentment in her expression, no desire for revenge, no lingering sadness, only peace. She offered a polite nod. Nothing more. Then she turned back toward Victor. The interaction lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Yet for Brandon, it said everything. Vanessa did not need closure because she had already found it. She did not need validation because she had already discovered her worth. She did not need the past because she was fully invested in her future. Minutes later, Victor and Vanessa walked through the grand ballroom doors and disappeared into the hotel lobby beyond. The city waited for them outside. New opportunities, new memories, new chapters still unwritten. Brandon remained standing where he was long after they left. Around him, staff quietly cleared tables and dimmed lights. The evening was ending. Yet one realization remained. For years he believed that night in the rain represented his victory. He thought he had been closing a chapter that no longer benefited him. Standing alone in the fading glow of the ballroom, he finally understood the truth. The door he closed had never trapped Vanessa. It had only removed him from the extraordinary life she was destined to build. And somewhere beyond the lights of downtown Chicago, Vanessa Carter continued moving forward beside a man who valued her completely, while the future stretched before them both brighter than anything either of them needed to prove.